At 6, the Prime Minister insists she won't cut public spending to pay for her multi-billion-pound package of tax cuts.
Have you wrecked the economy, Prime Minister? Time for another U-turn?
Liz Truss has been defending her economic plans during her first Prime Minister's questions since the Chancellor's mini-budget.
What we will make sure is that over the medium term, the debt is falling. But we will do that not by cutting public spending, but by making sure we spend public money well.
Does she think the public will ever forgive the Conservative Party if they keep on defending this madness and go ahead with a kamikaze budget?
It comes as official figures show the risk of the UK falling into a recession has increased. Also on the programme, human remains are discovered in a house in Milton Keynes by officers investigating the disappearance of a teenager in 2019. Blood supplies in England run critically low, and it's NHS staffing problems that are mainly to blame. Joining forces, how 3 of the UK's biggest conservation groups are challenging what they call the government's attack on nature. And the Only Fools and Horses star Sir David Jason on his collapse with COVID this summer.
And coming up on the BBC News channel, Premiership club Wasps are on the brink of becoming the second top-flight club to go into administration within weeks.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. The Prime Minister Liz Truss has insisted she won't cut public spending or scrap any more of her tax plans. In her first Prime Minister's questions since the government's controversial mini-budget, she defended her economic plans amid uncertainty in financial markets and the sharp rise in mortgage interest rates and government borrowing costs. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has warned that the Chancellor would have to find spending cuts of more than £60 billion to meet his target of getting public finances back under control. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, accused the Prime Minister of living in denial and said her decisions were causing so much pain. Our political editor, Chris Mason, has the story.
Take a look through the windows of Downing Street. The war in Ukraine and its consequences, spiralling prices. That budget statement and its consequences, borrowing costs up, the pound and opinion polls down. And one big question.
Have you wrecked the economy, Prime Minister?
Quite the backdrop for Liz Truss's second outing at Prime Minister's Question Time. Given the government's central challenge right now is proving the numbers add up, it was this exchange today that stood out.
During her leadership contest, the Prime Minister said, and I quote her exactly, "I'm very clear. I'm not planning public spending reductions." Is she going to stick to that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are spending almost £1 trillion of public spending. We were spending $700 billion back in 2010. What we will make sure is that over the medium term, the debt is falling. But we will do that not by cutting public spending, but by making sure we spend public money well.
So let's try to work out what that means. Some have said that ministers either have to junk those tax cuts announced a few weeks ago, or have to announce massive spending cuts to be seen to be credible. The government says it's not going to do either and isn't explaining how that is possible. One way may be that they include the big extra help being offered for energy bills as part of government spending and still make cuts elsewhere.
We have taken decisive action to make sure that people are not facing energy bills of £6,000 for 2 years.
Labour wanted to return to Liz Truss's tax cuts.
Who voted for this? Not even most of the MPs behind her who know you can't pay for tax cuts on the never, never. Does she think the public will ever forgive the Conservative Party if they keep on defending this madness?
And this senior Conservative backbencher who backed Rishi Sunak for Prime Minister is sceptical too.
There are many, myself included, who believe that it is quite possible that he will simply have to come forward with a further rowing back on the tax announcements.
And remember, the reason the government says it's doing all of this is to turbocharge the economy. But one economic group told MPs that's not going to happen anytime soon.
We're not going to hit medium-term 2.5% growth in this economy at the moment. This is something that's going to have to be nurtured, as I've said to this committee a number of times, over decades.
Tonight, Liz Truss headed for Parliament to face her own MPs in private. They have questions, and plenty of them. And that meeting has just concluded in the last few minutes. You know, at lunchtime I was sitting in the House of Commons press gallery looking down on the Conservative benches. It was a sea of glum faces, people who did not remotely look happy. There was a big cheer when the Prime Minister arrived. That cheer came from the Labour benches. It appears tonight that the government has inadvertently driven down a cul-de-sac and doesn't want to be seen to be reversing out of it. They hope, of course, that after some twists and turns and adventures over the grass verge, they may find their way through. Things might turn out to be okay. But there are plenty, including on their own side, who are questioning the navigation and questioning the driver.
Chris Mason, our political editor, thank you. Well, financial markets remain nervous after the Bank of England insisted its emergency support scheme would end this week, despite reports it may be extended. The bank has been buying bonds to stabilise their price and prevent a sale which could put some pension schemes at risk. Our business editor, Simon Jack, is here to explain. Simon.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Yes, so why are financial markets in turmoil and what does it mean for you? Well, the big problems are in the government bond market. So what is a bond? Well, essentially, it's an IOU from the government. The government borrows money from investors and promises to pay them back with interest. They're seen as very safe investments. Assume the government will always pay back its debts. Now, these bonds are bought and sold. It's a very big market and it's been unusually volatile recently. Why? Well, last month, the government promised huge tax cuts without really explaining how it would pay for them. This means those IOUs, those bonds, looked riskier. This meant investors wanted more interest to justify the extra risk. So the cost of government borrowing, you can see here, rose at its fastest rate over a short period of time ever. So what has that got to do with pensions? Well, pensions are big buyers of government bonds and they hold on to them typically for years. But some specialist pension funds, a few of them, have used them as collateral security to borrow ready cash now from banks to be able to pay out on things like pension promises. Now, when the value of that collateral, that security, started to plummet, those banks wanted more cash to make sure they didn't end up out of pocket. The pension managers had to sell more bonds to raise that cash, which pushed the price of bonds even lower, a negative selling spiral. The more you sell, the more you have to sell. To try and break that cycle, the Bank of England intervened, saying it would buy billions of pounds worth of government bonds off them to stabilise that market. But the bank governor, Andrew Bailey, said last night it would stop doing this on Friday. And here's what has happened. Let's look at that graph again. It worked at first, right here. You can see the borrowing costs came down. But now they're heading back to where they were before the Bank of England intervened. So how does that affect everyday life? First question. Are pensions safe?
The most important thing for people to remember is that these final salary type pensions have £2 trillion of assets standing behind them. So although there's been a lot of turmoil, there's a lot going on under the bonnet, those pensions are safe because there's a lot of money standing behind them and British businesses standing behind the pension fund. So although the headlines are horrible, the pensions are safe.
So they say, but there is another effect. The cost of government borrowing affects the cost of all borrowing, including mortgages. A year ago, a £200,000 typical mortgage on a £300,000 home would have cost around 2%. Now, that same mortgage is now being quoted at 5.7%. That's extra borrowing cost every year of £7,000. Now, most of that is due to interest rates rising all around the world. But between £2,000 and £3,000 of that extra cost can be directly linked to the government's not-so-mini budget. And 1.7 million people have to refinance their mortgages in the next 12 months. Sophie.
Simon Jack, thank you. Well, the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, has flown to the United States for the annual meeting of the International Monetary Fund in Washington. Shortly after he arrived, new figures showed the British economy unexpectedly shrank by 0.3% in August, strengthening predictions of a recession. Our economics editor Faisal Islam is in Washington. And Faisal, we know the IMF are sceptical about the Chancellor's plans. What reception is he likely to get?
Well, it's not just that prediction arising from the shock August economic figure going into reverse. It's also, as we've been hearing from Simon, the fact that the government borrowing costs have effectively gone up to 20-year highs because of the Bank of England saying that they would stop that emergency intervention at the weekend. But on top of that, the Bank of England chief economist was saying that the biggest risk arising from the energy shock is now not inflation but the public finances, which puts the ball firmly back in the court of the Chancellor in terms of finding a solution to this market turmoil. And if that wasn't enough, when he arrived here at this building, the IMF, also the Chancellor was having meetings with fellow G7 finance ministers from the world's biggest economies. And there are questions from across the world, from these finance ministries, about what's going on in the United Kingdom and whether this sort of situation is just adding unnecessarily to financial fragility at an already concerning time. And so you're left, when you put it all together, with the Prime Minister saying that there will be no spending cuts, but also saying there'll be no tax rises, that borrowing is going to stay under control. And you don't have to be a bond trader or a finance minister or even have a GCSE in maths to say, how is that going to work in the next 2.5 weeks? And that is the question being posed at the highest levels here at the IMF.
Faisal Islam, thank you. Well, there is plenty more detail and analysis on BBC News Online. That is bbc.co.uk/news. And you can also get that by using the BBC News app. Police searching for a 19-year-old who has not been seen for more than 3 years say they have found human remains. Leah Croucher disappeared while walking to work in Milton Keynes in February 2019. Thames Valley Police say they have launched a murder investigation. Our correspondent Joe Black is in Milton Keynes with the latest for us now. Joe.
Yes, Leah Croucher went missing on the 15th of February 2019 and she was captured just after 8 o'clock in the morning on CCTV making her way to work, about half a mile away from where I'm standing talking to you now. And if you look around the city of Milton Keynes, there are plenty of posters here because her parents, as you would imagine, launched numerous appeals about her disappearance. Now here today at this house in Thurston in Milton Keynes, there's been lots of activity, lots of officers going in and outside of this address, many of them in forensic suits. Now, what we have been told today by the police is that on Monday, after a tip-off from a member of the public, the police came to this address and started searching, and they found Leah's rucksack and other personal items. Today, they announced that they'd launched a murder investigation, and then a few hours later, they announced that they had found human remains. Now, the police have told us that the call on Monday was the first occasion that they were alerted to this address behind me. And they say the forensic work will continue and it will be some time to formally identify the deceased. And as you can imagine, this is a very anxious time for Leah's friends and family. They are being kept updated and supported by specialist officers.
Joe Black, thank you. A jury has been told that a nurse accused of murdering babies on a neonatal ward killed a premature baby girl on the 4th attempt and then sent the parents a sympathy card. Lucy Letby is charged with murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 10 others at the Countess of Chester Hospital in 2015 and 2016. She denies all the charges. Our correspondent Judith Moritz was in court.
Holding one of the babies in her care, Lucy Letby smiles for the camera. But today she was described in court as persistent, calculated and cold-blooded, deliberately sabotaging poorly and premature babies in the neonatal unit of the Countess of Chester Hospital. It's alleged that she attacked one baby after another until a pattern began to emerge.
I'm Dr. Ravi Jayaram. I'm a consultant paediatrician and I've worked for the NHS all my career.
The jury heard that this paediatrician who worked with her had started to notice the coincidence between several unexplained deaths and medical emergencies and the presence of Lucy Letby.
The court was told that one night Dr. Jayaram realised that Nurse Letby was on her own with a very premature newborn baby, that he felt uncomfortable about it given his concerns, and so he went to find her. When he entered the room, he found Lucy Letby standing over the incubator. The baby's oxygen levels were falling dangerously. But the monitor alarms hadn't sounded as they should have been, and the jury was told that Lucy Letby had made no efforts to help the baby or to call for assistance.
Prosecuting Nicholas Johnson KC told the jury that the doctor found the baby's chest wasn't moving and her breathing tube had become dislodged. Lucy Letby is charged with the baby's attempted murder. She watched from the dock as Mr Johnson said it was highly significant that children in her care persistently and consistently suffered emergencies. He said, sometimes the evidence of her hand at work is more obvious than others, and it's remarkable that on many occasions when children who'd suffered unexpected, spectacular and life-threatening collapses were removed from her orbit, they had exceptional recoveries. The court heard that in 1 week, Lucy Letby had tried to kill 3 babies. One of them, known as Baby I, was said to have been resilient, with a nurse trying 3 times to murder her and succeeding on the 4th occasion. Then the court heard she sent a condolence card to that baby's parents, something she later told police she knew wasn't normal, though she'd kept an image of the card on her phone. Lucy Letby denies all the charges she faces. Her defence team are expected to outline their case tomorrow. Judith Moritz, BBC News, Manchester.
The time is just after 6:15. Our top story this evening. The Prime Minister insists she won't cut public spending to pay for her multi-billion-pound package of tax cuts. And coming up, a BBC investigation reveals how the social media giant TikTok is profiting from donations made to Syrian refugees.
Coming up in Sports Day on the BBC News Channel, a big night in Glasgow as Rangers host Liverpool at Ibrox in the Champions League.
For the first time, 3 of the UK's biggest conservation groups are joining forces to challenge what they call a government U-turn on protecting nature. The National Trust, the Wildlife Trusts and the RSPB, which have more than 8 million members between them, say new government policy is an attack on nature and they urgently need assurances about legal protections for wildlife and changes to farming subsidies. The conservation groups say if they have to, they may encourage their members to take to the streets and protest. Here's our Rural Affairs correspondent Claire Marshall.
Today in Parliament Square, activists glued themselves to the road. Over the last 10 days, police say they've arrested almost 400 people. This is a world away from the tactics of more mainstream conservation groups.
So this is all about trying to get this message across to Ranil.
But their direct action has begun in a more genteel way. This was in the Environment Secretary's constituency last weekend. And now, in a highly unusual step, the heads of 3 of the biggest conservation organisations in the UK have come together to show their unity.
This is the biggest attack on nature that I've certainly come across in my lifetime, never mind my career. This is unprecedented, I have to say, and that is why we are stepping forward, the same as the Wildlife Trust and the RSPB.
To be fair to the Environment Secretary, he has said that these claims are simply not right, that going for growth will not come at the expense of the environment. I mean, there have been these assurances.
We can see in black and white, tabled in Parliament, proposals to remove all EU-derived legislation on protecting the environment, something around 570 pieces of legislation that's taken decades to put in place. It's going to take more than a few bland reassurances.
So what do they see as an attack on nature? There's the U-turn on the fracking ban, the review of environment-focused farming subsidies, the loosening of planning laws in new investment zones, and the potential ditching of vital European wildlife protections. RSPB members have written over 100,000 letters to MPs. What next?
This is something that we just can't allow to go forward. It is such a threat to nature in terms of its cumulative impact that we have to be able to do something about it. So I think all options are on the table in terms of what might happen next.
This administration's priority is growing the economy. This business park in Wiltshire was boosted by government investment.
Investment zones have got to have housing. Yeah. Now, if you're in a predominantly rural area like Wiltshire, getting housing into these green zones areas, you've got to be careful about how you do it. You've got to do it with people, not against them, though.
Despite all the pressure, the government insists that it is committed to halting the decline in nature. and its obligations to the environment will not be undermined by the pursuit of growth. Claire Marshall, BBC News.
Blood supplies in England are critically low. The NHS says they only have about 2 days of supplies left for some blood types. Hospitals are having to limit how much blood they use to make sure it is available for the patients who need it the most. Well, joining me is our health correspondent, Catherine Burns. And the problem's not just down to a shortage of donors, is it?
No, that's what you might expect. And actually, since this news came out today, there's been a surge in potential donors coming forward. At one stage, there was a queue of about 50 minutes just to get onto the online booking system. This problem, though, isn't about a lack of donors. It's about staff shortages, and this has been an ongoing issue since the pandemic. So to give you a sense of scale, NHS Blood and Transplant likes to have about 6 days' worth of blood stocks in England at any time. If you take just one type, O negative, which is the universal blood type, there are less than 2 days' supply. That means for the first time since the late 1990s, hospitals are being asked to limit their blood use. Now, this might include postponing about 1% of all surgeries. It'll be things like hip replacements, elective surgery. The idea is that emergency care, cancer care and transfusions for patients with long-term conditions will continue as normal. This will be no help, though, to the 6.8 million people currently on waiting lists for treatment. And don't expect an overnight fix on this. This Amber Alert, as they're calling it, will go on for at least 4 weeks.
Catherine Burns, thank you. Families living in Syrian refugee camps are using TikTok to beg people for donations, but the social media company is keeping up to 70% of what they're sent. A BBC investigation has found that vulnerable families and children are being given access to phones and TikTok accounts so they can go online live for hours and beg for money to be sent to them, as Hannah Gelbart reports.
Send me gift! Send me gift! Send me gift! For a like.
They're asking for help, for follows, for gifts. This is a new trend on TikTok. Working with BBC Arabic, we found more than 300 TikTok accounts posting these kinds of videos, with viewers sometimes spending more than $1,000 an hour in total on gifts. The idea behind TikTok gifts is to reward creators for interesting content. These gifts are bought with real money and can cost up to $500. The gifts are converted to a virtual currency that you can withdraw as cash. But how much of that goes to the families? And how much does TikTok take for itself?
You can see there's a pattern. The children seem to be saying the same kind of things. They're asking for likes and gifts. And if you listen closely, sometimes you can hear there's a voice off camera actually telling them what to say.
We asked a local journalist to visit a camp in northwest Syria. Mona lives here with her 6 daughters. They go on TikTok for 2 or 3 hours at a time, several times a day. She's saving up to pay for medical treatment for her daughter Sharifa, who's blind.
I tell them about my life in the camps and how we lost our home, and about my daughter's situation so that people will support me.
Hamid also lives in the camp and is known as a TikTok middleman. He sold his livestock to buy a phone and now works with 12 different families, setting up their accounts, filming and withdrawing their earnings. He says most of the gift's value is taken by TikTok before it even reaches his account.
The lion is the biggest gift. It's worth $500, but by the time it reaches the money transfer shop, it's only $155.
TikTok wouldn't tell us how much commission it takes on gifts in the app, so we decided to check for ourselves. We asked local journalist Mohammed to go live from an account in Syria and sent him $106, around £90, in gifts from another account. Then he went to withdraw the money. From the $106 in gifts we donated, TikTok took 73. That's almost 70%. The money transfer shop charged a further 10%. And people like Hamid, who provide the phones, take a cut of what's left. So from those $106, our Syrian family would have just $19. And often the families we spoke to get much, much less. In a statement, TikTok said that this type of content is not allowed on their platform, and they would strengthen their global policies around exploitative begging. A charity that works in the camp told us it could help support these families as an alternative to making money from TikTok live streams. But there are still hundreds of families going live from camps in Syria every day. And the lion's share of the money donated lines the pockets of TikTok itself. Hannah Gelbart, BBC News.
And you can see more on that in the documentary TikTok Begging in Syria, which you can find on the BBC's iPlayer. The rugby union side Wasps have withdrawn from Saturday's Premiership game against Exeter. They say it is likely they will enter into administration in the coming days. It's another huge blow for English domestic rugby after Worcester was placed into administration and suspended from the Premiership for the rest of the season. Our sports editor Dan Roan is outside Wasps ground in Coventry. What is going wrong for these clubs?
Well, Sophie, Wasps are among a number of Premiership clubs that have got themselves into significant amounts of debt. This is one of the most famous names in rugby, 6 times English champions, twice European champions. But the holding company behind it has been struggling to repay a £35 million loan to bond lenders linked to the club's move here to Coventry in 2014. It's also been pursued by HMRC over an unpaid tax bill of some £2 million. Now, the club had been hoping for fresh investment. In fact, the former owner of Newcastle United, the billionaire Mike Ashley, is among those thought to have been in talks with the club's management here. But today, in a statement, they effectively admitted that they'd run out of both time and money, and that it was likely, as you said, that they would go into administration in the next few days. And if they do suffer that fate, they may face automatic relegation. They are the Premiership's rules, and they'd be the second club in just 2 weeks to suffer that fate after Worcester Warriors, not too far from here. Part of that club was liquidated last week. All of the players were made redundant amid allegations of mismanagement and their own unpaid tax bill. The impact on communities is significant. There's serious questions now being asked about the governance, the sustainability and the finances of Premiership club rugby.
Dan Roan, thank you. The actor Sir David Jason says he collapsed when he had COVID this summer. The star of Only Fools and Horses and Open All Hours, who is now 82, said he was fine during the pandemic but caught the virus in July. He revealed what happened during an interview with BBC Breakfast's John Kay as he reminisced about some of his earliest TV work.
How have the last couple of years been, the pandemic and the changes to life?
Well, a couple of 3 months ago, I went to the Fairford Air Show and I caught the dreaded COVID. And did I get it bad? I got it seriously bad.
How did it affect you? What happened?
I got out of the bed in the early hours to make a visit. And because of all the muscles weren't working, I collapsed. My arms wouldn't work and my legs wouldn't work. I thought, how will I get from here to the door? I had to use my head. So now I'm lying face down on the ground, and in order to get to the door, the arms really weren't working, the legs weren't working. I'm sorry about this, but this is what happened. I was using my head to drag me to the door.
The BBC pantomime?
Yeah.
Christmas Day 1965?
My first appearance on television, yes.
Do you know what?
No.
BBC Breakfast has been into the BBC archives. It's probably a while since you've seen this, if ever. But if I press this...
Oh, God. Where did you get this from? How embarrassing is that?
You're one of the policemen, is that right?
Yeah. The flying policeman. Dear, oh dear. How embarrassing is that?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's all right.
What do you remember about when it appeared on television that Christmas evening? Did the family all gather round to see?
They were a sort of family that never made a big deal of it, not big fuss. My father would just sit there going, you silly bugger. Is that you flying about as a policeman? Yeah, I thought so. Anyway, it was a great achievement, let me put it that way.
Sir David Jason talking to John Kay. Let's have a look at the weather now. Louise Lear is with us. Louise.
Thanks, Sophie. Good evening, everybody. It is quite a tricky weather picture to try and paint at the moment. A real autumnal mess, really. We have seen some sunshine today, as you can see, across parts of the southeast. But for the majority of us, there's been a lot of cloud around, and at times it's brought some rain as well. Some of that quite heavy across parts of Wales. This has been the rain radar over the last few hours. So here's our weather front across northwest England down into Wales. A few scattered showers ahead of it. That front is going to sink its way steadily south and east as we go through the night. So a blanket of cloud and some rain, some of it pepping up for a time across Essex and Kent and maybe into East Anglia. Behind it, some clearer skies and a few scattered showers. So a real contrast in the temperatures. Chilly start in Scotland by contrast in comparison to the night just past. Double digits once again down into the southeast. Some early morning rain easing away, but for the majority of us, it will actually be quite a dry, settled, sunny day. By the end of the afternoon, however, yet more wet weather pushing into the far north and west. Temperatures similar values to much of the week, really. 11 to 17 Celsius the high. Now, as we move into Friday, it's all about low pressure, and low pressure stays with us for the weekend as well. So the isobars squeezing together, the winds picking up, and there'll be some rain around as well. So it looks likely that the wettest of the weather, the strongest of the winds across Scotland, Northern Ireland, 40-50 mile-an-hour gusts here. A little bit drier further south and east. Temperatures again generally between around 10 to 17 Celsius. Remember that low pressure I was talking about dominating the story, and that rather messy weather picture? Well, it looks as though the palette will be one of sunshine, showers and blustery winds for all of us as we go through the weekend. Sophie.
Louise, thank you. And that's it from us on the BBC News at 6. The news continues here on BBC One. It's time now to join the BBC's teams across the nations and regions for the news where you are. Goodbye.